All right, so imagine this. It's 1942 in Los Angeles. The city is alive with wartime energy. Factories are booming. Hollywood is pumping out propaganda films and golden era classics, and thousands of people are moving west in search of jobs and a better life. But beneath all that promise and progress, there's a dark undercurrent. Racial tension so thick you could feel it walking down the street. Mexican-American communities were growing rapidly in LA, and with that growth came fear from the white establishment. Not because of crime, not because of real danger, but because of difference. Cultural difference, skin color, language. And then, right in the middle of this volatile climate, a young Mexican-American man named Jose Diaz is found dying near a reservoir known as Sleepy Lagoon. The headlines the next day claimed it was a murder, but the real crime hadn't even started yet. The truth is, when police arrived at the scene, they had absolutely nothing solid to go on. No eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, no definitive motive. The only thing they had was a body, and a city that was ready to point fingers. They didn't pause to investigate properly. They didn't consider every possibility. What they did instead was act on assumptions, racial ones. They jumped to the conclusion that this had to be some kind of gang killing, and worse, that it had to be carried out by other Mexican-American youths. This wasn't about solving a case, it was about finding a convenient group to blame, and fast. So what did they do? They launched a citywide dragnet, sweeping up young Mexican men by the hundreds, literally hundreds. They weren't looking for truth, they were looking for suspects that fit a stereotype. Over 600 young Mexican-American men were taken into custody. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's not justice, that's a manhunt based on race. These boys were questioned without lawyers, held in overcrowded jails, and often beaten during interrogations. Some were picked up just because they were wearing zoot suits, the baggy, flashy outfits that had become a symbol of Chicano pride and defiance. It didn't matter who they were. It didn't matter where they were that night. If you were brown and looked a certain way, the cops wanted you. Eventually, 22 boys were singled out and charged with the murder of Jose Diaz. They became known as the Sleepy Lagoon defendants, but history would prove they were anything but guilty. The trial was a disaster from the very beginning. These boys were treated less like citizens and more like criminals before they even entered the courtroom. They weren't allowed to sit with their attorneys. They had to sit in the courtroom as a group, dressed in zoot suits that were used to visually reinforce the idea that they were gang members. It was theater, not justice, and the judge allowed it all to happen. He let the prosecution refer to them as a mob, even though there was no evidence they were part of any organized group. The defense attorneys were often overruled. The boys weren't given a fair chance to defend themselves. It was a show trial, and the goal was clear: send a message to the entire Mexican-American community. And let's talk about the prosecution's so-called evidence. It wasn't evidence at all. It was junk science mixed with racist pseudo-psychology. They brought in so-called experts who testified that Mexican people were inherently violent due to their Aztec blood. Yes, seriously, these men stood in front of a jury and claimed that an entire group of people had a genetic predisposition to murder. That's the kind of nonsense that was being passed off as fact in a court of law. They didn't present any physical evidence linking the boys to the scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon, just prejudice, plain and simple. The prosecution didn't build a case, they built a narrative, and it worked. The media didn't just go along with the story, they poured gasoline on the fire. LA newspapers ran wild with headlines painting the boys as violent thugs. The phrase "Zoot Suit Gang" was repeated over and over. Photos of the defendants were plastered across front pages. Reporters didn't question the case or dig deeper. They amplified the fear, and the public ate it up. Suddenly, Mexican-American youth were seen as a menace to society. They were no longer just teenagers. They were enemies of the state. The media had effectively dehumanized them before a verdict was even reached. And that verdict? All 22 boys were found guilty. 17 were sent to prison. 3 were convicted of first-degree murder. These weren't just convictions, they were life sentences handed down by a broken system. Most of the boys were still teenagers. Some had never been in trouble before, and now they were going to spend years behind bars for a crime there was no proof they committed. Think about what that does to someone, to their future, their family, their sense of self. These weren't just legal failures, they were acts of violence committed by the very institutions that claimed to serve justice. But here's where the tide started to turn. The Mexican-American community didn't stay silent. Activists, journalists, and even a few celebrities took up the cause. A group called the Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee formed to demand justice. One of the loudest voices was Carrie McWilliams, a journalist and civil rights advocate who exposed the trial's racism. Actor Anthony Quinn, who would go on to become a major Hollywood star, also lent his voice. These allies helped bring national attention to the case. They exposed the sham trial for what it was, a modern-day lynching dressed up in legal robes. Finally, in 1944, 2 years after the arrests, a California appellate court overturned every single conviction. The court found that the boys' rights had been violated from the moment they were arrested. It acknowledged the trial had been conducted in a way that completely disregarded the Constitution. All of the Sleepy Lagoon defendants were released, but the damage? That couldn't be undone. They had already spent years in prison. Their lives had been derailed, their names dragged through the mud, some never fully recovered, and the real killer of Jose Diaz? Still unknown to this day. And yet, even after the case was overturned, the stereotypes it created didn't disappear. In fact, they got worse. Just a year later, in 1943, the Zoot Suit riots erupted in LA. White servicemen attacked young Mexican Americans in the streets, pulling them out of movie theaters, buses, and cafes. They stripped them of their clothes and beat them while cops stood by and did nothing, or arrested the victims. The Sleepy Lagoon case had planted a seed of fear and hatred that was now blooming into violence, and the city let it happen. This wasn't just about a single murder. This was about how power can twist the truth, how racism can hide behind badges and black robes, how a city can choose fear over facts. The Sleepy Lagoon case showed that the justice system, the media, and the public were all willing to sacrifice the truth if it meant preserving the status quo. And it proved that in the 1940s, Los Angeles, being brown was enough to make you guilty. We don't hear about this case in school. It's not in the textbooks, but it should be, because this story isn't just about the past. It's a warning. It reminds us what happens when we stop questioning authority, when we let fear override facts, when we look the other way as entire communities get criminalized. The Sleepy Lagoon defendants were victims of one of the most racist legal disasters in American history, and they deserve to be remembered not as criminals, but as symbols of resistance. And Jose Diaz? He deserves justice too. Real justice. Not the kind built on fear and lies, but the kind that demands truth, no matter how ugly it might be. Because that's how healing starts. That's how history stops repeating itself.